The biggest reason people struggle with sleep anxiety is because they think about it as a sleep problem. But in reality, at its most fundamental level, sleep anxiety is not a sleep problem, it's an anxiety problem. And if you want to successfully overcome sleep anxiety, you have to use the tools of anxiety, not sleep. Hi, my name is Nick Wignall. I'm a clinical psychologist and the founder of The Friendly Mind, a free weekly newsletter where I share practical, evidence-based advice for emotional health and well-being. As a psychologist, I've spent years helping people work through a variety of anxiety and sleep problems, including sleep anxiety. And what I'm going to share with you in today's video are 3 ways you can overcome sleep anxiety by counterintuitively ignoring the sleep part and instead focusing on the anxiety part. Number 1, stop ruminating on bad sleep. Now, as I think anyone who struggles with sleep anxiety probably realizes, worry is a big part of sleep anxiety, right? Because the more you worry, the more anxious you feel. And if you're worrying a lot about your sleep or not being able to sleep or the consequences of not sleeping, like how you're going to feel or your performance, all sorts of stuff like that. If you're doing tons of worrying all the time about that stuff, obviously you're going to feel more anxious. And the more anxious you are, the more aroused you're going to be. And the harder it's going to be to calm down, relax, and then fall asleep. That should all be obvious. What's less obvious to a lot of people is one of the most important causes of worry, and kind of sleep worry in particular, is something almost no one thinks about, because in some ways it's the opposite of worry. So worry technically is negative, unhelpful thinking about the future. You're imagining all sorts of terrible things that could happen. You're catastrophizing about how terribly you're going to feel tomorrow because you only got 4 or 5 hours of sleep, something like that. Rumination is the kind of the inverse of that. Rumination is unhelpful, negative thinking about the past. Now, where this shows up a lot with sleep, and people don't think about this as much because it's not worry, and it's not things people typically associate with anxiety and sleep anxiety and insomnia. But people who struggle with insomnia generally, and especially sleep anxiety, tend to do a lot of ruminating about their sleep problems. Now, what this looks like is it could be, let's say you and your partner both wake up in the morning and your partner says, "Oh, how did you sleep?" And then you kind of go into, "Oh, it was awful. It took me forever to fall asleep. I don't know why. I lay there and I worry and these thoughts are racing through my head. And then I finally fell asleep, but then I woke up in the middle of the night. It took me 2 hours to get back to sleep. God, I feel like garbage now, and I've got this big presentation I have to give." Okay, so break character. Nothing could be more natural, especially if someone asks you about it, right? But to describe your trouble with sleep, because sleep troubles are awful. Again, I was a psychologist who specialized in insomnia for almost 10 years. So I've worked very carefully with people who have had extreme forms of insomnia. And I know firsthand that going through insomnia, especially severe insomnia, it is the worst. Like, it is hard for people to understand how bad insomnia is, but it is really, really awful to go through that. And when you're going through something that awful, it makes tons of sense to be anxious about it, but then to not only worry about it, but to think about it and what it's costing you and to talk more about it, especially if someone very well-intentioned asks you about it. Right? Because it's a problem and you want to address the problem and you're looking for support. So for a million reasons, it's totally normal that you would want to talk about your sleep problems or think about your sleep problems in the past, whether it's someone asking you about it, or maybe it's you asking someone else. Like maybe you and a coworker both tend to have sleep problems, and you are in this habit of, you kind of commiserate together about how poorly both of you sleep and what a struggle it is. And that can feel really good, but there's a name for this. It's called co-rumination. And just like ruminating ourselves, going over and over something negative that's happened in the past, that can be really problematic. In a lot of areas, it's one of the big causes of depression, for instance, ruminating and being kind of like overly critical about mistakes we've made in the past. But it tends to perpetuate insomnia and sleep anxiety in particular because, and this is key, it's a trigger for worry, which might sound strange, but think about it for a second. If you spend all day long, or at least big chunks of your day, either thinking on your own, ruminating on your own about, "Oh, last night, I can't believe it took me that long to fall asleep," or "God, I feel awful, like I wish I could just sleep," stuff like that. Whether it's your own thinking in your own head, Or spending time, you're talking to your spouse, your partner about it. You're talking to your coworker about it. Maybe you're kind of venting in your Facebook group, your insomnia Facebook group, and sharing about how your struggles and stuff like that. You got to think about this from your brain's perspective. If your brain sees you spending all of this time focusing on sleep, and especially the really negative aspects of sleep and effects of not getting enough sleep, you're telling your brain, hey, this sleep thing, super important, really, really important. And if you're telling your brain, if you're constantly reinforcing to your brain how important sleep is and how terrible things are when you're not sleeping, it shouldn't be any surprise that your brain increasingly starts throwing worries at you about your sleep, because you've essentially been reinforcing that topic to your brain. So this is a lot of people who struggle with sleep anxiety. Again, like I said before, they have a ton of worry about sleep, about getting anxious, about not sleeping, about the effects of not sleeping, all that kind of stuff. What they don't realize is that unintentionally, they are contributing to all that worry by ruminating, by venting, by complaining, by talking too much about their sleep and their sleep problems. So if you want to worry less and feel less anxious about your sleep, one of the best things you can do is to completely just stop as much as possible ruminating on your poor sleep. Because here's the thing about rumination. It very well may be true that you have all these sleep problems and it's leading to all these other issues in your life and it's terrible. Yes, that is all true. The question is it helpful? And the vast majority of the time, ruminating on your sleep troubles and your anxiety about sleep is not actually helpful, even though it's true, because it just makes you more and more anxious and revved up about your sleep. And so you end up thinking more about it, worrying more about it, which just causes more sleep anxiety, which makes it harder to sleep. And then you want to ruminate even more about it. And you can see how this vicious cycle kind of takes off. So it sounds strange, but I would really do a careful audit of kind of your day and how you spend your day as it pertains to sleep, and think carefully about, okay, where are all the situations throughout my day where I tend to ruminate on sleep? Again, think about whom do you talk to about sleep? Again, your partner, coworkers, kids, like whatever, stuff like that. Where do I write about my sleep? Again, do I like post in forums, or am I in a group chat where I text about it a lot? Do I kind of compulsively research about sleep and insomnia and anxiety, right? That's all spent. Or do I just, anytime I feel bad, is my mental habit in my head to kind of scapegoat my sleep? I go right to like, oh, I'm feeling so tired today. It must be because I only got 6 hours of sleep instead of my normal 7.5. Or I've got this headache. Like, God, if only I didn't have insomnia, just jumping right to the insomnia being the problem. And again, maybe that's true. It may very well be true. The problem is stewing on it, dwelling on it, ruminating on it is unhelpful. It's only making the problem worse long term. So again, you want to inventory sort of your life for all these areas where you may be ruminating on your poor sleep or the effects of poor sleep. And as much as possible, try to remove those things. One particularly bad offender for this, I think, is sleep trackers. I think there's a few narrow use cases where sleep trackers can be useful, but the vast majority of time, especially for people who have insomnia or who have a lot of sleep anxiety, the kind of downsides completely outweigh the upsides when it comes to sleep trackers, because as much as it's kind of cool to see your little like sleep score of 86 tonight or whatever that is, even assuming those things are reliable, what they tend to do is they just get you thinking about and often worrying about your sleep a lot more. And that just contributes to the problem of sleep anxiety and insomnia. So get rid of those sleep trackers. Stop talking about your sleep so much. Stop, posting about it or researching about it, and treat it like an experiment. I'm not saying you have to do this, but if you cut down on that stuff, even by half, by 50% for a month, I would bet a lot of money that you would have less sleep anxiety and an easier time going to sleep as a result. So give that a shot. Number 2, no worrying in bed. Now, whenever I say this to people, especially people with chronic insomnia and sleep anxiety, I get an enormous eye roll. People are like, oh my God, yeah, wouldn't that be nice if I could just not worry when I'm in bed? Right? It sounds very flippant when you hear someone say this. They'll just don't worry in bed. But there's actually, there's a important message in there that a lot of people who struggle with sleep anxiety and insomnia don't consider enough. And that is it comes down to the nature of worry. So I got to take a quick sidebar to talk about worry and actually the difference between a worry and worrying, which you may never have thought about. A worry is a very different thing than worrying. A worry is a thought your brain throws at you. So you get into bed and the thought pops into mind, what if I don't sleep at all tonight? You didn't choose to have that thought. Your brain just threw it at you, right? That is a worry. It's an automatic thought. It's not, you didn't choose to do it. You didn't have any control over it. There's nothing you could have done to sort of prevent that. It's out of your control. That's a worry. But here's what happens. In response to that initial worry, you start elaborating on the worry. You start worrying. You think, oh yeah, God, 3 nights ago, I didn't sleep at all. And that the next day was awful. I'm probably going to have a really crappy day tomorrow. And I can't do that because I have this big talk I got to give. I would be a wreck if I did. Even if I only got 5 hours of sleep, I wouldn't be able to do it. And then, if I don't nail this talk, what's going to happen? I probably won't get this big promotion that I've been hoping for, on and on. You can kind of see. So what's key to see here is yes, you couldn't control the fact that a worry, that first worry popped into mind, but all the other worries that came after it, those elaborations, that is under your control. That is a choice to continue worrying in response to a worry. And it is essential that you understand that distinction and that you take responsibility for that second type of worry. That deliberate thought, the thought you initiate and maintain, worrying. However difficult, that is something you can do or not do. You can have a worry and not continue to worry about it. It's not easy, or at least a lot of the time it's not easy. It's very difficult, but you know what? A lot of things in life are like that, but they're still important. So it's really important to get crystal clear with yourself about this distinction between a worry and worrying. Okay, now all of that is sort of a setup for this bigger point about not worrying in bed. It's unrealistic to think that you'll never have worries pop into your mind, especially if you have insomnia or sleep anxiety, right? You're definitely gonna have worries pop into your mind. But you can make the effect of those worries so much less if you get better at halting that initial worry and not elaborating on it with more worrying. But it's critical. The first thing is it's critical to know and to remind yourself that is possible. You are not at the mercy of worries. To a large extent, worrying is a choice. It's a behavior. It can be habitual, but like any habit, you can break it. But you have to be conscious of that and you have to remind yourself, I have agency over this. There are these worries I can't control, but after that, I can decide whether I continue to worry or not. Absolutely essential. Now, no worrying in bed. Why don't you want to worry in bed? Well, it should be fairly obvious, on one level, the more you worry, the more anxious you get. And the more anxious you get, the more aroused you get. And if you're trying to fall asleep, you need to move in the other direction. Arousal is going to keep you up, right? Relaxation is what's going to allow sleep to happen. So you're definitely moving in the wrong direction if you're worrying a lot in bed. But more than just yes, in the moment, it's going to be harder and harder to fall asleep if you're worrying a lot and getting more and more anxious about your sleep. But there's a more important long-term consequence that comes from being in the habit of worrying in bed. And that is what psychologists call conditioned arousal. Conditioned arousal is this phenomena. It's basically a version of, you've all heard of Pavlov's dog, probably. The basic idea with Pavlov's dog is Pavlov had this dog, and dogs, if you just ring a bell to a dog, the dog's not going to do anything, right? Similarly, if you show food to a dog's going to start drooling, right? Those are both kind of natural responses. What Pavlov figured out was really cool is that if you show a dog food and ring a bell at the same time, and you do that a few times, then you can just ring the bell without the food, and it's going to prompt the dog to drool. The dog has learned, it's called classical conditioning. It's become conditioned to believe that food is going to come along with the bell. Now, why am I telling you this? Because it's the same process that happens with people who have a lot of insomnia and sleep anxiety, which is if you are in the habit of, you get into bed and you worry, or you wake up in the middle of the night and you're in bed and you immediately start worrying. What you're teaching your brain is that the bed is a place for worrying and worries. You're associating your bed with worry. Now, the reason this is problematic is because you might get into bed one night and you might actually not be particularly stressed out. Might not be that worried. You would normally just get into bed and be pretty sleepy and fall asleep. You have nothing to worry about. But because you have trained your brain to associate your bed with worrying, your brain will throw worries at you as soon as you get into bed. It's an automatic trigger, right? So even if you had nothing to worry about, your brain will make up worries because that's what it thinks the bed is for. Because you unintentionally have taught that to your brain, that the bed is for worrying. In order to break out of this conditioned arousal cycle, which is a huge contributor to sleep anxiety and insomnia, it's really important that you, again, get really strict with yourself about not responding to a worry with more worrying. And how do you do that? Basically, you need, and this is part of, I teach a course on overcoming insomnia. And one of the most powerful techniques in that course is something I call the midnight plan. And the midnight plan is just a very simple idea that is everybody who struggles with insomnia or sleep should have an activity that they do when they find themselves in bed, unable to fall back asleep. And this activity, it can take a variety of forms. It could be, reading a book on your Kindle. It could be listening to an audiobook or a podcast. It could even be, and people go nuts when I say this because it breaks all the rules. It could be watching TV. The point is, worrying in bed is like the worst thing you can possibly do in bed if you struggle with insomnia or sleep anxiety, because it's going to shoot your anxiety through the roof. And nothing is more arousing than intense anxiety. So even if theoretically, watching the news at 2 a.m. in bed, that's not ideal, right? But it's a lot less arousing than worrying about not being able to sleep and how terrible you're going to feel tomorrow when you have only slept 4 hours or something like that. Same with reading in bed or listening to an audiobook or a podcast or music. Sure, in a perfect world, all of us would just get into bed and close our eyes and we just fall asleep without needing anything else. But we don't live in the perfect world. And for some of us, we live in a very imperfect sleep world. And so we need to be realistic in the sense of, okay, eventually, sure, I want to be at that place where I don't need anything to fall asleep. But to get there, I need to slowly work my way up to that. And so one of the ways you do that is with a midnight plan. And your midnight plan is for whatever works for you. And you have to experiment a little bit to find the right thing. But you need to find an activity that you can, when you find yourself worrying unhelpfully, you can immediately just say, nope, I'm not going there. I'm switching to, for me personally, I'm a big Sherlock Holmes junkie. I love reading Sherlock Holmes. And so I have this Sherlock Holmes book on my phone. I keep my phone on my nightstand. It's my alarm clock. And so if I can't sleep, if I wake up in the middle of the night and I start worrying and I can sort of feel myself getting more aroused, I'm going the wrong direction. I'm going over there. I want to go over here towards relaxation and sleep. But if it happens, and it happens. I don't struggle with insomnia a lot, but sometimes I can't sleep. Totally normal. When that happens, I don't think about what I should do. It is simply a rule in my head that if I start worrying in bed, I cut that worry off and I pull out my Sherlock Holmes and I read, because that gives me something to put my attention and focus on, something that is enjoyable and relaxing, and that keeps my mind off of worries so that I can get back into that state of relaxation. And once I'm relaxed, sleep can then take over. Sleep can kind of pull me into a lower level of consciousness. It's not going to happen if I'm aroused because I'm anxious and worrying, right? Now, it could be anything. I use a book. Could be some people like music. Some people like podcasts, like whatever it is. You're going to have to experiment a little bit. But the key point here is you have to be super strict with yourself about this rule of no worrying in bed. It is inevitable that some worries are going to pop into your head. You can't control that. That's okay. But you can control how you respond to a worry. And the most important thing is that you do not let yourself slip into worrying, and instead have a structured, predictable, algorithmic plan for what you do instead. Again, there's a variety of ways, formats that could take. Experiment, find one, but then be very strict with yourself and just go to that thing instead of laying in bed worrying. Number 3, schedule time to worry on purpose. So in the last point, we talked a lot about how this distinction between a worry and worrying, right? And you can control worrying. That's a decision, right? You can control that, but you can't control worries. Like if your brain just throws lots of worries at you, that's a bummer, but you can't really control that. And I need to put a little nuance on that statement. You can't, in the moment, you can't control that directly. You can't just tell your brain, all right, I'm getting into bed, so no worries from now on, okay? Like, wouldn't that be nice? You can't do that. You don't have that direct control. But you can indirectly influence how many worries your brain throws at you. And the best way to do that is through a technique that I love. I think it's my favorite exercise in all of psychology. It's so cool. It's partly because it's so counterintuitive, but it's also so powerful. It's anytime I work with a client who's got insomnia, some type of anxiety, or critically, the kind of the worst of both worlds, both sleep anxiety, this is my number one go-to exercise. And when people do it, this sounds crazy. It sounds unrealistic, but it is honestly completely true. When people have done this exercise consistently, I have never not seen it had a dramatically positive effect on their anxiety and their ability to sleep well. It's not a total magic bullet, but it is by far the most powerful technique I've ever seen when it comes to helping people be less anxious about their sleep and their insomnia struggles. And that technique is called scheduled worry. That's even the phrase is like cool because the idea of scheduling your worry is strange and counterintuitive, maybe even a little scary. Like, why would I want to deliberately schedule time to worry on purpose? So the way to think about this, my favorite metaphor for what the psychology behind this technique is, I think about if you have ever trained a new puppy. Even if you haven't trained a new puppy, you probably get the gist of what happens. And that is, puppies, like people, don't come out of the box, so to speak, housebroken. When they have to go potty, they just go potty wherever. It might be in the backyard, it might be on the lawn, it might be on the patio, it might be on your couch in your living room. Because again, they don't come pre-programmed to respect, the rules of your house and only go potty in the litter box or your special place. So how do you train a puppy to be housebroken? How do you potty train a puppy? Turns out we know exactly how to do this. And more importantly, we know how to not do it. What doesn't work is yelling at your puppy or trying to explain via an argument why it's not a good idea to poop on the living room carpet and instead to do its business outside. Your dog's not going to get it. You can spend all day explaining and use the best arguments, and that's not going to work. You have to train your puppy to do its business in the right place and not in the wrong place. And how do you do that? Well, turns out positive reinforcement is way more effective than punishment. And what that looks like is that when you get your puppy, when you can see that it's getting ready or needs to do its business, you take it out to the spot, maybe it's a little dirt patch in the backyard or a litter box or whatever it is. And when it does its business there in the correct spot, you reinforce it. You give it praise, you give it a little treat, whatever. Basically, you give it attention and praise when it does it in the right place. And then you just leave it alone when it does stuff in the wrong place. And as the puppy learns that it gets rewarded for doing its business in the right place, it does it more and more there and less in all the other inappropriate places. Now, you're like, what is this guy talking about potty training dogs for? This is crazy. This is a sleep anxiety video, right? Well, it turns out, to a large extent, you can train your brain in a very similar way. In particular, your brain's tendency to throw worries at you. You can retrain it to not do it so much through all hours of the day. As you're driving your kids to school, you don't need to be worrying about whether you're going to sleep super well tonight or what might happen if you don't. Or if you're in a meeting with your boss at work, you don't need worries about sleep happening to you. Or certainly, if you're laying down to fall asleep, you definitely don't need worries then about not sleeping. So how can we encourage or train our brain not to worry so much at inopportune times? And the best way to do it is this very counterintuitive thing of training it to worry at the right time in the sort of litter box, so to speak. So scheduled worry is all about creating a specific time and place for your brain to worry and rewarding it for worrying at that time. Because the more it learns that it gets rewarded for worrying in this specific time, the less likely it is to do it in other times. Now, does this mean you're never going to worry about sleep at any other? No, of course not. But you can dramatically cut down the amount of worries you have at inopportune times about sleep if you reinforce your brain for worrying at the right time. So scheduled worry, what does it actually look like? It's actually super simple. You pick a time. You can do it any time of the day. In general, kind of afternoon or early evening tends to be the best. For me and for most of the people I've worked with, my clients, kind of early evening tends to be optimal. Like when I do this technique, I tend to do it around like 8 o'clock. I put my kids to bed at 7:30, 7:45. And then my wife and I usually watch TV or read a little or something before bed for an hour, hour and a half. So I will spend that time right after I put my kids to bed, but before I start watching TV or reading with my wife. I'll spend 10 or 15 minutes doing scheduled worry from like 7:45 to 8. That's a pretty good time because it's not, you don't want to do it right before bed, obviously. But in the evening is kind of a nice time to do it. So anyway, pick your time. 10 minutes is a good starting point. And what you do is you pull out a sheet of paper, and actually, like I just use like a little notepad, right? Legal pad, something like that. It can be anything, right? You could do it on sticky notes if you want to. It really doesn't matter. You set a timer for your given amount of time. 10 minutes is pretty standard. So set a timer for 10 minutes. And then all you do is you get pen. It's important. Do this with pen and paper, not digitally. If at all possible, do it with pen and paper. And what you're going to do is you're just going to start writing out your worries. Any worry you can think of could be the smallest thing. I always use the example of forgetting bananas at the grocery store, to nuclear war, right? Huge, impactful worries. But you're basically you want to take worries from your head and put them onto paper. Critically, you are not solving your worries. This is not about the content of your worries. Because remember what we're doing here. Remember the potty training example. It's just about training. You are telling your brain, we have a time for worries. So go ahead, brain, like throw them all at me. Give them to me. Like I'm here, I'm listening, I'm taking notes. I'm giving you attention, brain, for worrying at this time. So again, it's not about the content of your worries. The goal of this exercise is simply to create a space for worrying and to reinforce your brain for worrying at this time, which by extension will make it less likely that it worries or throws worries at you at inopportune times later on. And now, so what you're just writing down worries. If you can't think of any more worries, just return to worries you've already written and keep writing those down, elaborating on them, whatever. Once your timer is up, here's what you do. You stop, you rip up your sheet of paper and you throw it in the garbage. Because again, you're not looking for patterns, you're not analyzing for deep meaning, none of that stuff. All you're doing is reinforcing your brain for worrying at the right time. So you take it, you throw it away. Then the next night, same thing. Write down your worries. You're going to have some new worries probably. Maybe something different happened that day. Maybe you thought of new worries that you sort of forgot about. But what's going to happen is as you start doing this every single day, I tell you what, it's going to get really boring because you're going to go over the same worries over and over and over again. And this boringness is actually one of the secret ingredients to this technique. See, a lot of us are essentially afraid of worrying. We start worrying and our brain throws a worry at us. And the reason we start worrying more is because we're terrified of worries. It's a funny thing to think about, but a lot of us actually have this conditioned fear response to worries. And one of the ways we deal with that fear is by worrying more, because we think is a generous term here, but we feel that if we think more about our worries, somehow that'll solve them or get rid of them or something like that. Anyway, so one of the reasons we go from a worry to worrying, which produces so much anxiety and makes it hard to sleep, is because we're afraid of our worries. This scheduled worry is essentially exposure therapy for chronic worry. By deliberately approaching your worries, you show your brain I don't like them, they're uncomfortable, but they're not dangerous. And when you do this enough, you build confidence in your ability to just have a worry and then let it go. You don't have to do anything about it, right? You just note it and then you let it go. That's exactly the skill you want to be able to build so that you can have a worry in the middle of the night or when you're falling asleep initially and just let it go. and not get to it. That's the other really powerful thing that scheduled worry does. So if you are interested in this technique, I created a little web page just for scheduled worry and my approach to doing scheduled worry. So it kind of lists the steps. And there's even a video of me literally doing it. It seems like kind of boring, but if you're really into this this technique, it can be really helpful. So scheduledworry.com. You can just check that out. There's a little explainer webpage. And then also, if you really want to go deep on this and really learn to kind of take control of your worry habit, I have a whole course on chronic anxiety and worry called Creating Calm. And I do like a really deep dive on scheduled worry, among other things. There's 3 or 4 other kind of core practices in there. You can look at that. I'll put a link in the description below if you want to learn more about that. But that is the third of my kind of techniques for overcoming sleep anxiety. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you want to learn more from me about insomnia, anxiety, and other aspects of emotional health, I write a free weekly newsletter called The Friendly Mind. It goes out every Monday morning, and I would love to have you join us and be part of our little community. You can do that using the link in the description below. Cheers.